Okay, it's time to start this final panel theme on architects' information. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel, this final panel of this afternoon. And my name is Anders Bergström. I'm responsible for this sub-area within architecture in effect. And we have a great audience that's actually staying on this late hour. And we're also happy that so many of our colleagues have accepted to either present or to listen to this theme. I would like to direct a special welcome, of course, to our international guests in this panel, Professor Dana Cuff and Professor Joan Ockman. I will introduce you more thoroughly in connection to your talks here, but let's just say that we're delighted that you have accepted our invitation and that we hope you feel welcome to Stockholm and Making Effect. I will start by giving just a short introduction to the panel theme, and as you see, it examines the formation of the architect in relation to architecture education and connected research cultures, combining historical, pedagogical, and epistemological perspectives, and mostly developed in the other themes, actually. These projects that are going to be presented are different in size and scope, and some are completed dissertations or research projects. Others are ongoing or affiliated PhD or research projects. So they're not symmetrical in that sense, but they have only 5 minutes all to elaborate on their results. The issues at stake in this architect information panel includes gender aspects and queer and feminist theory. They include cultural values reproduced within the profession and transmitted during the early years of an architect's training, as well as the role and image of the architect in a political culture of building and planning, compared with a traditional view of the architect as sole creator. Furthermore, they include the quest for knowledge in architectural practice and its results for architectural education, as well as the renegotiations of utopian desire in architecture. And finally, they include aspects of justice and a critically engaged practice. Before we start, just a short note on the program. First, Dana Cuff will give us an introductory keynote, followed by short presentations by Bradley Burroughs, Kristina Grange, Fredrik Nilsson, Fredrik Torisson, och Maria Ärlemo. After these presentations, Joan Ockman will give a responding keynote, and after that we open up, hopefully, for a panel discussion, and hopefully also for further questions from the auditorium. Now it's time to introduce our first international guest, Professor Dana Cuff. Dana Cuff is Professor of Architecture and Urban Design and Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the founding director of City Lab at the UCLA. Over the last decades, you've published important books on American urbanism, notably The Provisional City and Fast Forward Urbanism, which you will discuss further, actually, in a lecture at KDH on Monday. In this environment, however, this book, which you see in this slide, your seminal book, Architecture, the Story of Practice, which was published by the MIT Press already in 1991, has been a main reference for us, and you've contributed extensively to the field of architecture and the profession. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Please start your introduction and feel welcome here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel like architecture in effect is something that I've been part of since the beginning also, since our meetings in Umeå so many years ago and my long engagement with architecture teaching here in Sweden. So I really appreciate coming back. I want to think about I'm going to be very brief because we hope we get 2 questions from the audience in this panel. Yes, our goal. I just want to look at the kind of talks that are going to come up in our panel and think about them in relationship to my own work, which we'll talk about, Joan and I, tomorrow a little bit more in our discussion about education. But it's a little surprising when we think about architectural education, how stable the core of that entity is. And I think this image captures that. Of course, those students just arrived on the right at UCLA. They don't have their computers out yet. But the idea of how we work, the ways we inform one another, the ways masters, and I use that as a gendered construct, and novitiates work together really hasn't changed much. I'd say one of the biggest innovations in the United States in architectural education now is that we let students work in teams. Not a very radical notion, but in fact it's had this kind of undermining quality in terms of the sort of notion of the author in an important way. It's not just that we're working on computers now either. This notion of diseño, or the drawing, also being part of that stable core, still defines the architecture métier and is very difficult to resist. I think what's interesting about the work that you've developed here, and I'm extremely envious of the high level of discourse and collaboration that you've formed over these 5 years. I can say, just from my own experience with Swedish academia, that the level of discourse is just profoundly transformed by these 5 years of working together. And I can't imagine 4 schools, even in Los Angeles, let alone in the United States, that could develop such an interesting theoretical kind of debate. So this stable core, if we acknowledge that that exists in architecture as a discipline and practice and education, it probably pushes us, as we've heard from Bell Hooks and many others, towards the much more interesting margins. And I think that's where the papers that come up lie. These active, contested margins of our discipline is where the most interesting work is happening. And these are the questions that seem to generate, the papers that you will about hear in the next panel generated for me. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to this notion of fictions. We just had a series of papers about representation, and one form of representation that we don't discuss enough, it seems to me, is narrative. And along with Hayden White, the idea that really history is a kind of fiction and the practical past is the way we deploy history in our formulations of our own narratives seems to me very important in the papers that we'll see and in architectural education more broadly, in a way that gets to the issue of positionality that really defines much of the discourse in architecture and politics in at least the United States today. There's no longer such a thing as exceptionalism in America once Donald Trump was elected, except for that probably we're exceptional in this new sense of the egregiously horrid. But I think that the importance now of operating in this contested landscape of subjectivities and positionalities is something that architecture is bringing to bear in the way we establish the values that govern our educational process, and by so doing, the narratives that we formulate about our work. So I would just like to talk a little bit about the experiments in education that I'm engaged with at UCLA through 2 primary initiatives. The first one is a Mellon Foundation grant that's a little bit like the Formus grant here. It's something that about 15 different universities across the English-speaking world, somehow they skipped Sweden, have engaged in to tie together the humanities, architecture, and urbanism. And our particular project, which I lead, is called the Urban Humanities Initiative. And in it, we're specifically looking at forms of narrative representation that can be part of the creation of a more humane city. And so really, it's almost a historical return to bringing the humanities back to architecture. And tying that politically through the construct, literally, of the city. And so we look at cities along the Pacific Rim, and we develop new forms of exploring them and discussing them together. One of the primary means being thick mapping, which has to do not just with layers of mapping or thickness a la Clifford Geertz, but some kinds of basis in both those things. It's also looking at the sort of multiple narratives and types of coded understandings and interpretations we can bring to maps. And so we're using GIS and trying to enrich it and thicken it through live stories that you can tell, through overlays of different kinds of data analysis, and histories that we can bring to bear through geographic registrations. We're also using the urban humanities initiatives as a kind of pedagogical experiment, and having not been that interested, except for in a kind of researcher-like fashion, in how pedagogy works. Ironically, since, like many faculty members, we're in the classroom all the time, but putting ourselves as the subject of that material hasn't been something I thought about very explicitly. Now we are actually very conscientiously working on pedagogy and how we might enrich it as a multi-positional kind of project, partly because of the wide range of students we have when we bring together planners, architects, and humanists, PhD students and professional students. And some of the kinds of projects that we do, not only the thick mapping, and now we're also working extensively in video and video essays and video narratives, have been the kinds of politicized actions, maybe you'd call them art practices or social practices. Oh, my little GIF, my GIF isn't working here. Let me see if I can get it to go. Because it's a PDF. We worked on a project with a neighborhood group in the creation of storytelling as a part of a literary justice project. So each project that we take on has a kind of basis in the community, that it involves engaged scholarship, so that the students actually bring something to the project as well as learn something in the project, and then it stays in the community and has a life of its own. In this case, it's a storyteller's box that gives out Spanish language books to children who don't have books in their homes for the most part, which has to do with data that shows that the primary means towards literary competence has to do with books in the home. The second means, and I'm not going to talk about this at all here, has to do with my research lab, which is a little different than the kinds of laboratories that are in the Swedish schools. It's a kind of funded from the outside-based research lab in which I engage a number of graduate students. I think at the moment I have about 9 or 10 working with me from different disciplines on research projects that yield policy as well as demonstration buildings, not unlike Alberto's work that he was doing at Umeå, so that we see the connection between research, data, building practices, and in the end, social impacts. So I just leave these in your mind to think about as we hear the next 5 papers, and I look forward to joining you in appreciating these 5 different researchers' work. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dinah, for your introduction. And there are several aspects here to discuss, but we will keep the comments to the last part. And now I say welcome to Dr. Bradley Burroughs, who completed her dissertation last fall at KD School of Architecture. And you're going to present your thesis here. Most welcome to Making Effect.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just get started. In 1991, in her chapter, The Making of an Architect, Dana Cuff wrote, "As the terminology indicates, crits are not two-way discussions. For the most part, students are the passive recipients of jurors' opinions." In 2003, Naomi Stead, also my opponent, pictured in the red boa, wrote, "In a sense, the traditional design critique, even given its long tradition and hallowed place in architectural education, can be seen as a rather blunt and unsophisticated instrumentalization of criticism." Now, although the atmosphere is perhaps more convivial today, I wonder why traditional critique and criticism remain the most prevalent form of learning and evaluating in a design education. If we, as architectural educators, researchers, are trained to think both critically and creatively, Why do architectural critiques or even research seminars, at least in a European or North American context with some exceptions, generally follow the same setup almost 30 years later? To put it another way, are we necessarily teaching architecture students to be critical thinkers? Or are we merely teaching them how to imitate an accepted performance of critique and criticism, where they perhaps avoid taking risks and learn to adopt what Helena Webster calls surface tactics in order to survive and eventually emulate that same performance? This project begins with the claim that the architectural discipline is centered around a culture of critique, which is based in what Bell Hooks calls a system of imperialist, white supremacist, heterosexist, capitalist patriarchy, and that the values instilled by this culture not only begin with, but reinforced and reproduced by the education of young architects. Sounds serious. The project aims to shift this culture of critique by questioning relationships of power and privilege through practices that are explicitly queer, feminist, and campy. In other words, it takes seriously what we usually deem unserious in the architectural discipline in order to undermine the usual order of things. What if the critical is performed differently? And this project proposes one way to do this with Flirtation. The book is titled Architectural Flirtations, A Love Story, designed together with graphic designer Anders Bergström. And it's written as an architectural pulp fiction, which combines architectural design, critical theory, and fiction. Central to the fiction, there's a row house in Mozzo, Italy, just outside of Bergamo, built in 1977 and designed by architects Aldo Rossi and Attilio Pizzigoni. In the guise of character Beta Ring, I take one of the row houses and renovate it in an unserious way by setting up parameters for myself as if they were a design task you might encounter in a design studio. So you could say that this is my architectural object of affection, or what I'm flirting with. And along with some of Rossi's writings, it also acts as a stand-in for architectural design and discourse. On the entrance floor, we have my central team of critical theorists, along with their key concepts. We have Gavin Butt, Jane Rendell, Sarah Ahmed, and Bell Hooks boogieing down in their newly renovated Disco Library studio. The fictional stories revolve around Beta, her 3 neighbors, and the ghost that's trapped in purgatory on the 2nd floor, while they help program the physical changes in Beta's row house renovation. We have Zita, the bohemian spinster who lives alone with her 3 cats. We have Beta, the campy researcher renovator. We have Adelina, the Italian designer and neighbor from hell. And we have the ping pong guy who is only interested in the ping pong table in his basement. And on the 2nd floor, I've also designed 3 new acoustic details that interact with the neighbors to either side and some of our companion species in this residential area, which is Donna Haraway's term for our animal friends. If we zoom in on the 2nd floor, you see that the renovated unit twists the original structure and that the details begin to connect with the neighboring houses. We'll take a glimpse at one of the details, which is located at the top, that swinging one, that forms a connection between Beta's guest room and Adelina's Nordic design showroom, where her pet cockatoo, Hugo, is kept alone in his cage as part of the decor. This detail, called the bird bath, is a satellite dish inset in the abstract figure of a hand, made of perforated sheet metal on a hinged metal arm, all with the same verdigris color patina as the original details of Rossi's house. It attaches to the opening of the window in Beta's guest room and swings over to the outside of the window of Adelina's showroom. And here it attracts local birds and provides a small bath and a place to perch, while it reflects their chirping noises toward Hugo in order to keep him company, and also to irritate Adelina, of course. In each detail, I also continue my flirt with Aldo Rossi by playing on elements from his other works and sketches in the design. For instance, This detail materializes Rossi's sketch, La Finestra del Poeta, New York, with the window and the hand of the saint from the San Carlone, Verona. So, in conclusion, following Susan Sontag's notes on camp, this project is my attempt to be serious about the frivolous, frivolous about the serious, or to perform the critical differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brady, for your presentation. And now I call on Professor Kristina Grange, Chalmers University of Technology. You're going to present a project that you actually presented in our environment, but we never funded it. So we're very happy that you're here anyway.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm also very happy to be here. And I'm going to talk about this project, Deserving One's Role, ? That's important, in search of the political in the shaping of professional acting space. And I've been investigating this for a long time, but I wanted to mention now 2 projects. The first one is a project financed by ARQ and ArkDes with a title Deserving One's Role, and it consisted of 11 interviews with architects and 11 interviews with clients. And what I found very problematic in that research project was that so many architects said we need to show that we can deserve our role. And also very many clients said the same thing about the architects. And after a while it just felt very strange that it was something that was repeated so many times. However, today I'm not going to talk so much about that project, but I'm going to reconnect to this thing, deserving one's role, because I think maybe there is something else that is needed. Maybe there's more like fearless speech that is needed today. So what I'm going to talk about is a Formas project with the title Shaping Acting Space in Search of a New Institutional Awareness Among Swedish Municipal Planners, which has been running in parallel with your big project. And in that project, I investigated ideological changes to planning and also consequences for planners' acting space. And I did this through 3 international case studies. So England, Denmark, and Sweden. And today I will just try to be very brief, and I want to emphasize 3 observations. So the first is, I think there is a very clear shift in the relationship between politics and planning going on. And I think we can see tendencies. Their power is moving upwards in the whole Swedish society, but also in planning. And there is a transfer of power to full-time politicians and civil servants management. So managers are often becoming facilitators of politics. They see their prime task as facilitating politicians' ideas. This means that planners on a lower level are left solely with issues of implementation. So the critical aspect, I feel, is going away a bit from planning. And I also see that there are increasing demands for loyalty. So, for example, politicians correct planners' official statements and expect planners to be loyal. And there have been some discussions about this also in the Stockholm Town Planning Office. Another observation I want to point to is there is much more focus on planning today, but I wonder if there is a loss of faith in planners. Several international scholars have pointed to that there is a general loss of faith in the idea of planning, with less authority as a consequence. And I also think I see very clearly, especially in other countries like England, that there is a political criticism of planning going on. So, for example, one UK minister officially said that planning is a cross between the last... can be understood as a cross between the last bastion of communism and sheer bloody-mindedness. And there have also been studies from England showing that many planners today silently accept to work towards values that increasingly differ both from their personal and professional ones. And I think then there is reason to question what kind of society are we creating if we plan what we don't believe in. And a third observation I want to point to is that I feel that planners' competence is increasingly becoming a means of control. And we can see today a wave of planning reforms going through Europe, and they are driven by the same political agenda, and that is very much to make planning more positive, proactive, and strategic. And I think it's very clear that there is one aim going through here, and that is to strengthen a growth agenda through these reforms. But what is interesting is that those reforms have very many times been accompanied by parallel political interventions aimed at culture change in planning. So state governments have directly tried to intervene in the culture of planning. And this one can understand this as technologies of subjectivities, when one tries to change how someone thinks. And they are deeply ideological, I would say. So I think there is a strong governing today towards certain forms of urban development which generates economic growth at the expense of social issues. And I very much feel that this is a democracy problem, this change in relationship between politics and expertise. However, the Swedish system is actually a bit different than many other systems, because the Swedish political systems, our government agencies are actually separated from the ministries. So there is a little gap there where it's expected to be some kind of discussion between politics and expertise. And the latest official investigation of democracy in Sweden emphasized that civil servants are the guardians of Swedish democracy. So what I want to say is that we should understand that as planners and expertise and architects, we have a role to be a counterforce to politics, actually, and to be a constructive counterforce. And in that way, I think there is reason to argue for some fearless speech among architects and planners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristina, for your presentation. And now it's time for Professor Fredrik Nilsson of Chalmers University of Technology. You were also one of the founding directors of the research environments, actually. And you're going to present a project that you performed together with Mikael Hensel in Oslo. Feel welcome to Making Effect.
Thank you very much, Anders. Yes, I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, but it relates to the other presentations in this session. Also, it's about the changing shape of practice, which, as Anders said, is a project that I've been doing together with Professor Mikael Hensel at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. And it has been going on for quite some years, and it led to a first symposium at Chalmers in 2013, which led to the book with this title, published in 2016. There was a second symposium in Oslo last year, and also earlier this week I was in Aarhus for the third symposium on the changing shape of architectural practice. And just go briefly about the background to the book and some of its contents. Well, our question was when we saw that architectural practices worldwide really had to deal with increasingly complex design requirements in many aspects. And we asked, well, how do contemporary practice acquire new knowledge? How do offices and practices relate to research in their own design practice? And that, of course, led to some sub-questions that we tried to deal with. What is then practice-oriented research? What do practices research, and how do they internally conduct and facilitate research? And what we have seen is, of course, this increasing integration of research in architecture practices of different sizes worldwide, where new ways of meeting these new challenges that we have to address, where we need both scientific and artistic and design research. And what's also emerging, or we can see here, is that the design research is an increasingly important part of research in practice. but then combined with, of course, traditional modes as well. And just a brief background, there was a debate in the 1990s about the need for research in architecture practices, where we saw offices like OMA and MBRDV more working in structured ways on these issues. To simplify, in the beginning of this millennium, there was also an intensified debate on the specificity of architectural research, where also the current research at that time was criticized by, for instance, Alejandro Sairapolo, said that some of the most advanced architectural research looked like bad movies, bad sociology, bad literature, where we just imported from other disciplines. And I would say that last decade, one can almost witness what I see almost as a paradigmatic shift with an increased focus on research and development in architectural offices, where there's now attractive to actually have researchers and PhD employed in practices, and also stronger communication of those activities on web pages of practices and so forth. And of course, this can be seen as a way of trademarking the offices, as a kind of selling point, but there are also, in some instances, a quite thorough base for this, where, for instance, Perkins and Will started an own peer-reviewed research journal to capture and document research questions and methodologies that arise prior, during, and after the design process. And also the office of Kieran Timberlake is described as practice designed to support research, engendering a deeply rooted culture of inquiry. So this led to a book project where we tried then to compile or study practices of different sizes from different parts of the world. You see the content of the book here, where we also grouped them in the size of how many employees they had. Over 700 employees and up between 100 up to 100 employees, and also smaller offices with fewer than 25 employees, because we thought that this probably would show some patterns on how you are able to fund and structure research internally. And what we aimed to show was what kind of research that was done, how it was done, organized, and facilities, and how that related to the specific scope of the office. But what appeared was a quite diversified picture with a lot of different approaches to these aspects. It was not very clear or easy to draw some or see some patterns in this. But we at least saw two important factors that drive the element of research in the offices. It was the increasing complexity of architectural urban project, that there was a huge need for new ways of working with it, to gain new knowledge. But also the digital technologies and their rapid development is also at the core of many offices' research. And these two, of course, interact. Because it's a very complex world we have to deal with today, with the construction that has been discussed in these sessions, and all the aspects coming in, how we interact with this complex as human beings, but also how we construct under very tight time frames logistics to very advanced projects. And to do this, of course, we have got new tools, both to grasp all the contents of the architecture, the use of it, and model and work with that, but also the more technical aspects through the digital tools that make us see things in different ways. And just to give some examples of what we also saw with, for instance, the funding mechanisms, that there was some things that were recurring, both on very large-scale offices as well as a small scale. That many, even in the ones being large, they were usually project-based, where research was dependent on each project's budget. But there are also company-wide initiatives with more long-term cross-project developments. More and more external funding for research, also from clients and other companies, but also from government funding bodies. And also a few examples of offices having own foundations, with dedicated foundations for internal and external research. The research was also structured in different ways. Some had dedicated units within the company, but many of the offices also have they were distributed in networks, so tried to connect to competences company-wide. Some of the offices had separate companies, like, for instance, GXN within 3XN, the Danish company, for certain research and development, and also architectural offices as spin-off firms from advanced academic research. For instance, the Spacescape from advanced research at KTH. And what we saw was this multitude of methods from the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities that is still needed alongside with the new emerging modes of research. But just to conclude, one of the most important things or interesting things that we saw was also this offices that used consciously research as part of the design culture, as an important part of the specific office culture and its strategic development. So, well, practice is changing in many ways, and this integration of research is one way of doing it. And of course, this poses questions both to the education of architects, but also the continued exchange between academia and professional practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fredrik, for your presentation. And now I call on Dr. Fredrik Torisson, who defended his dissertation just before summer. And this is what you're actually going to talk about. Feel welcome to Making Effect. Please start your presentation.
Yes, I defended my dissertation in June. This is it, and I'll now try to sort of speed read it for you in 5 minutes. We'll see how that goes. It is, as you probably guessed from the title and the subtitle, about the Utopian, and the question that will, without doubt, be in your mind is why on earth would anyone sort of open up that can of worms? Why would the most infected and the most exhausted, in a sense, concept in architecture? I've asked myself that question a few times as well. But at the same time, when you start looking at the utopian concept and you sort of start seeing that it's sort of become reduced to this category where things are either utopian or not utopian, and the sort of how the concept appears as something that we as architects never talk about, but when you start digging into it, it becomes a little bit more interesting. So I've sort of tried to rethink the concept along the lines of German philosopher Ernst Bloch. And so if we begin by assuming that utopia is not about solving anything, but rather about posing problems differently, and that is based on what we could call a utopian desire, which is founded in desire for transformation and survival, rather than the end of transformation and immortality. This operation may seem rather counterintuitive at first, I realize that. But then utopia becomes a kind of, utopian desire becomes a sort of intensity rather than a category. Formulated this way, utopian desire is more or less omnipresent, Bloch would argue, and I would argue along with him, but oftentimes it's residing in the unconscious. Utopia is then not defined by its boundaries, that is, this is utopian, that is not utopian, but something more far more common and less epic or than is habitually assumed. Utopian desire is then, I argue, expressed in artifacts in different ways, including architectural production, as propositions in response to utopian problems, which we may not be fully aware of. And as such, a proposition is invariably contingent on situation and shared beliefs. This means that the utopian problem cannot be comprehensively resolved. But what is important, I would argue, is that what the proposition does and how it helps us sort of to explore problems, not what's in the drawing in that sense. So looking at architecture, the question becomes not which architecture is utopian, which is not, but how architecture is utopian. And in this sense, utopia serves to challenge presuppositions and doxa, reformulating the problem differently. Utopia is in that sense monstrous. Its function is to open up that which is taken for granted, and to open up and challenge the presuppositions that define the horizons of our imagination, and to show us that the future is not necessarily predetermined. Following this line of reasoning, it is not only the self-proclaimed utopian that is utopian, but to an extent all architecture expresses in one way or another utopian desire, what architect Rem Koolhaas once called architecture's dirty little secret. Utopian desire is expressed differently in different architecture. A desire for another world, for transformation, may be more or less elaborately expressed and more or less thoughtfully expressed in different types and different forms and practices of architecture. And the second part of the study discusses utopian expressions in the present discursive field of architecture, where I argue that the present worldview is dominated by what could be dubbed a network image as an image of thought. We think of everything in terms of networks, privileging connections over form, or privileging networks and connections over basically everything else. And the architect is in this sense assuming another role for herself as a manager of resources and connections. And I would argue that the network image is based on a premise that I call arborophobia, or a fear of trees, where the logic is, if the tree is the problem, the network is considered the solution. And the network topology is habitually assumed to be democratically superior to tree topology, precisely because it is not the tree. The network is justified as a negation of the tree, but this juxtaposition, I argue, is essentially false. The network is not the opposite of the tree. Such an constructed dualism obscures the qualities and premises of the network itself. The network's own power relations and the elements of control are there overlooked. And I would argue that the network functions differently than the tree, that there's an element of control that provides a different kind of hierarchy, but this does not mean that it is without hierarchy as such. Very briefly, the discussion in this study centers on the need to challenge this network image itself and examine it closer, and not only take our role in it as given. The dissertation is an argument for considering the how of imagining the future with more scrutiny, and it offers a set of principles and a terminology for this discussion and to enable further research on the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fredrik, for your presentation. And now I call on PhD candidate Maria Ärlemo. You will present your ongoing PhD project at KTH School of Architecture. Welcome to Making Effect.
Thank you. Hi. My research stems from a sense of unease experienced as a practicing architect. I wasn't really sure that I was contributing to a just city, and what you see here is me sitting there wondering. Looking into theory, there is a lot of theory on justice from an urban perspective, but there is the notion has been less developed in relation to architectural practice. And the central question in my research is therefore, what could perhaps an architectural justice be? And a position taken in my research is that critical architecture is possible, not because I know how, but because I see no alternative to such a position in a contemporary society increasingly marked by differences between those who have more and those who have less. And
Perhaps a bit closer to the mic.
closer. Right. Is this better? Yeah?
Yeah.
So justice is a normative concept with a multitude of meanings. And by use of an ethnographic approach, I have explored understandings of justice as they have been conveyed by actors involved in the modernization of Husby, a large-scale post-war housing area in Stockholm. And the case has been selected due to a local discourse on justice that has been developed among grassroots over the last decade in the area. What you see here is an image of Husby when it was built as an ideal local welfare community in the 70s. And there are three understandings of justice which are dominant within my material. And one of them is a distributive understanding of justice. And Husby was in the 1970s, as I said, built as an ideal local welfare community with an abundance of welfare services. And in line with the shift in political ideology, many of these have over the years been relocated, minimized, or closed down, and or taken over by private actors or non-profit organizations. And a great sense of loss is conveyed or expressed among informants that have lived in Husby since it was built. And one of them referred to the 90s as the decade of the Great Massacre of the local welfare services. And what you see here is a mapping that I've done as part of the research project, which looks at the shift in programming of space in Husby. And the most apparent shift could be said to be a decrease in common indoor spaces with about 2/3, which you can see at the bottom there. And another dominant view of justice is a procedural understanding of justice. In 2007, a municipally political initiative to lift Järva, as it was denoted, Järvalyftet, was initiated. And it became known to the residents in Husby by the sending of the landlord of a letter stating that we will rebuild your house and you have to leave. And this shock stirred up a massive local engagement, which since has struggled to gain, to give a greater influence over the development of Husby to the local residents. The third dominant view of justice is conveyed is a sense of justice as freedom from oppression, to be treated fairly. The tenants who moved into Husby when the area stood ready in the 1970s were primarily middle-class families, white middle-class families. But over the years, due to racialized process of segregation, today most of the inhabitants have either immigrated themselves or have parents who have immigrated to Sweden. And today about 85% of the inhabitants in Husby have such a foreign background, as it's called within Swedish statistics. And youths in Husby with an immigrant background tell of experiences of police harassment, negative media reportings, and not being listened to as recurrent and central parts in their everyday lives. And a claim made by them is to be treated with respect. And what you see here is an occasion where a local youth organization called Megafonen arranged a press conference following the riots in the area in 2013 to tell their story of the actual social causes for the riots and not the sort of official and public telling of it as being just youths being angry. And what then could be learned from the case of Husby for a sketchy attempt, a very sketchy attempt, I want to emphasize, to draw up a framework for architecture practice. The dominant views of justice conveyed by the informants in Husby to a large degree correspond with the political philosopher, the definition by the political philosopher Nancy Fraser of justice as marked by redistribution, recognition, and representation. And each of these aspects of justice has had implications for architectural practice in Husby. The implementation of redistributive justice in the development of Husby in the 70s was accompanied by a great degree of centralized power, bureaucracy, and standardization. A central role for the architects in the process was to secure that all tenants, in accordance to the universal approach applied by the Swedish welfare state, were given access to the equivalent quality of housing, and an aim strived for by the application of an extensive package of buildings norms. So all were to be given access to the same, was the aim. And looking at the issue of representation, in response to the claims made for greater local influence over the currently ongoing modernization process, a structure for a greater local representation has been established. And within this structure, the tenants have explicitly been given the status as clients and experts. And the role of the architects is to, really quick. The role of the architect then become to, within reason, sort of facilitate both collective and individual desires and needs. And when it comes to the justice in terms of respect or freedom from oppression and recognition, architects part of the modernization of Husby have to some degree be seen by their clients, Svenska Bostäder, as a liability. Following instances where architects have made use of stereotypic wordings and imaginary to illustrate the local community and their visions for its development, architects have at times in the process been gagged. So to me, at this point in my research process, it seems to be room for improvement within all these aspects of justice within architecture practice. And there is a tension in between the aspects, and at times they will be incompatible. And what I suggest then is the application of what the urban planner Heather Campbell denotes as a situated ethical judgment. Hence, I make no claims of providing an answer or a answer, but simply to contribute to a discussion on the ethics of the architecture profession.
Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. And now it's time to introduce our next international guest, Professor Joan Ockman. Joan Ockman is currently visiting professor at Cooper Union and Cornell University. And she taught for over 20 years at Columbia University. She also served as director of the Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. And over the last decades, you published important books on architecture theory, notably Architecture Culture, 1943 to 1968, and The Pragmatist Imagination, Thinking About Things in the Making, which was an important, in fact, reference for one of our research environments. And in this panel, your seminal book, Architecture School, 3 Centuries of Educating Architects in North America, which appeared at MIT Press in 2012, is, of course, a very important starting point. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Please start your responding keynote and feel welcome to Stockholm and Making Effect.
Thank you very much, Anders. Thank you, Micah, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here in Stockholm for the second time for me. So it took me a while to kind of understand the scope of this ambitious project that has been going on here for the last 5 years or so, and to understand the different rubrics that were in play. This idea of making effect, trying to put these words together, thinking about things in the making, thinking about effect and affect. And then the title of this particular session, Architects in Formation. Does this mean architects themselves in formation, meaning having something to do with the process of their education and subsequent formation as professionals? Or architecture information or architecture information, in other words, the relationship between architecture and information. In any case, all these thoughts then led me to the 5 abstracts that I was provided with in advance here, and they seemed initially very diverse to me, but what I took from them was the following. So from Brady Burroughs, to undermine the usual order of things was her stated purpose. Kristina, the issue of making planners loyal to current neoliberal politics. From Fredrik Nilsson, the growing interest in research and the increasingly complex environment we operate in respect to both society and technology. Fredrik Torisson, the question of utopia, the need for utopia, the idea of a future not predetermined, but also the need to challenge a network image that's become so prevalent these days. And then in relation to Maria's work, the question of architectural justice, but the shift in the context of a shift from emphasis on issues of equality and welfare state values to private alternatives. So all that led me to what I'm calling rather crudely here a new, not so new, N-word, neoliberalism. And so my remarks are going to kind of revolve around that. And I think we all know what neoliberalism means, but to take David Harvey's definition, neoliberalization, as he writes here at the bottom, seeks to bring all human action into the domain of the market. So an architect's information operating within this milieu. And as you see, he even mentions Sweden in this particular quote as one of the places that has made this shift. So another N-word, New York for present purposes. And, you know, architectural friends used to come to New York and say, what's new? What should I go see while I'm here? And from about 1975 to 2000, there wasn't much. You know, we'd say, well, just look at the city as a whole, or maybe go and revisit the Seagram building or the Guggenheim or something. That's all changed. New York has been growing madly for the last 15 years or so. And a lot of this was jump-started under the mayoralty of Michael Bloomberg, who was the mayor that preceded the present, de Blasio, who in certain ways, despite a different politics, has continued those policies. Growth is good. That's a mantra that is the case in this new neoliberal world we live in. Here's Bloomberg's proposal from 2012 to rezone the most congested part of Manhattan, namely the area right around Grand Central Station, for higher skyscrapers. And here's a little visualization by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, where we will, of course, preserve the station. We'll put a halo over it, in fact, one that rides up and down vertically and can be also used as a observation deck. So that was a way of, I guess, persuading everybody that this was a great idea, and that the sacred cow would not be destroyed. So Bloomberg, leaving office at the end of 2013, suffered an amazing defeat. His proposal was voted down, but only, as you see, this August, to be finally voted in. So the lid is coming off Midtown Manhattan, and things will get higher and higher, and already are doing that. Well, you know, regret about history's absence is tiresome. What can you say? Of course, another attempt to get over nostalgia. It comes from this little text by Rem of 1995. Whatever happened to urbanism? And the idea that urbanism as a practice has disappeared, paradoxically, at a moment when urbanization is happening all over the globe. At least that's what he's describing in 1995. And so what's the solution to that? The seeming failure of the urban offers an exceptional opportunity, a pretext for Nietzschean frivolity. We have to imagine 1,000 other concepts of city. We have to dare to be utterly uncritical. We have to swallow deeply and bestow forgiveness left and right. In a landscape of increasing expediency and impermanence, urbanism no longer is the most solemn of our decisions. Urbanism can become gay science, light urbanism. What if we simply declare that there is no crisis, redefine our relationship with the city, not as its makers, but as its subjects, its supporters? Among other headline projects that have been undertaken in the last years in New York, certainly the High Line has been one of the most celebrated, and the first phase opening in 2009, phase 2 in 2011, phase 3, the last phase in 2014. And of course, widely praised as a new concept of urban park, a way of reclaiming infrastructure that was decayed, but I think little did everybody realize at the start of things that what was really going on, really in the works, this was laying the groundwork for a major new urban development now called Hudson Yards. So this is what's happening right now. It's been going on since 2012. And we get another constellation of higher and higher skyscrapers built over the rail yards of Penn Station now in phases. And I want to recommend to you a really extraordinary essay by a young writer who writes a lot on architecture and media. Her name is Shannon Madden. And in this piece that was published in the online journal Places in 2016, she describes this whole project. And maybe I can just take a couple seconds to read it here. So Hudson Yards is the largest private real estate development in the U.S. history and the test ground for the world's most ambitious experiment in smart city urbanism. We're talking about the smart city now. Over the next decade, the $20 billion project, 7 blocks between 30th and 34th Street, 10th and 12th Avenue, will add 17 million square feet of commercial, residential, and civic space, much of it housed in signature architecture. This is a land of luxury and logistics, fitness and finance, marketing and media, couture and curation, fine dining and data, all situated amidst abundant open space, including various public amenities. Here comes a digital revolution characterized by ubiquitous connectivity, sensors, location-based services, social networks, advanced computing power, the ability to analyze data, and new design and fabrication technologies like 3D printing and robotics that promise to solve all our needs, to build urban community and give people a greater sense of personalization. So this is the holy grail of Hudson Yards. This is the vision of Michael Bloomberg that is now being realized. And you can see the extent of this project. It's huge, as was just described. But this idea of the smart city, the informatic city, the city that is combining data culling with research and experimental techniques, all then managed in ways to, and with all the kind of feedback loops that are involved in that collection process to plug back into the system and to act as a model for other cities. That's also part of the initiative here. So again, this is part of the array of Bloombergian initiatives that's now continuing on, and indeed the academy, the universities, the schools in the city, together with partners all around the globe, have also been brought in for the ride. In this case, NYU gathered with others, and this particular project located especially in Brooklyn, but well, back to High Line for a second. So here we see the renderings, the kind of the marketing and media that is accompanying all this, the culture shed, which everybody's anticipating. It's going to be a great fun palace actually realized here. All that as part of this new city. For whom? For what? What is this this project, and what's the role of the architect in producing it? Well, you know the whole story of the creative class, this theory that Richard Florida, educated at Columbia in urban planning, came out with in 2002. He's now having a kind of a bit of a conversion. Here he is in 2017, eating his words a little bit, or looking for another kind of solution, understanding that gentrification by creatives can lead to crisis. But in any case, this is the way that we're seeing the city being built and built out to not just Manhattan, but the boroughs, certainly Brooklyn. This is Shop's project for the Domino Sugar Factory, just opening now. Another somewhat contentious project, although greatly touted. Who again is who is this for? What does this give back to the city? Who has the right to this city? All these questions are absolutely being raised. The problem of housing, of course, being a crucial one. Michael Sorkin noting that there's no consensus about housing as a right. It's merely a good. Martha Rosler had made the same point a lot earlier in the middle of Times Square, but somehow we haven't changed our view of things. So finally, this new academic, industrial, governmental research complex that's being created all over the city. This is now Cornell on Roosevelt Island. Cornell actually with the Technion of Israel building this huge campus, the first campus ever built for the digital age, bringing together academia and industry to create pioneering leaders and transformational new research products, companies, and social ventures. Douglas Spencer, in his recent book, Architecture Neoliberalism, contemporary architecture is implicated in the introduction of new and distinctly neoliberal modes of labor and its organization. It's engaged in the retraining of subjectivities, rendering them cooperative and flexible. It smooths over precarity, struggles, and contradictions. Architecture finds its concerns with post-political ontologies of complexity and emergence, self-organized massing of swarms, mirrored in the discourse and agenda of managerialism. Architecture's centered on the design of open, landscaped, and connective spaces, on the production of spaces designed to facilitate communicative, networked, cooperative behaviors and dispositions, proclaim themselves to be aligned with a progressive reality. Well, you know all this, but it's happening in New York. And this simply came from the New York Times 2 days ago. And before I put this presentation together, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joan, for your response. And we have a few minutes left, so I now call on all of us to take a seat for some conclusive comments. And I would like to raise one question which is important here, because this is actually the final panel. It's not the final program point, but the final panel, which means that we have some sort of possibility here to come to some sort of conclusion here. What these events, this event and these environments actually meant to the architecture profession in Sweden. And in that case, I would like also to raise one question here about what is practice, and if research and education is a part of practice. Often you make some sort of division, that academia is one thing and practice something else, and there's some connection between them. But I would like to propose and Dana has done that before. That actually education and research is a part of practice. It's all one practice, and it's important, of course, for our environments what architectural research is. Sort of architectural research is that researchers actually have some sort of connection to architectural practice. And in that sense, that's how much does these environments and this event mean to our profession? Is it actually some sort of major achievement for the profession as a whole, and not just for us as scholars? Fredrik, perhaps start.
Var så snäll och sätt på mikrofonen. Tack.
Well, I think as a last session, I think this was very interesting, and the way that you frame it here, Anders. I think that there's still quite a lot of questions that we have not raised, and not least a true discussion about what's come up here in many ways as an ethics of both our profession and the education of that. We have. I think that, as you say, this is really not something that we train for. It's something that goes on all the time. This relations between and also, well, Dana started with how do we have we really transformed the way we educate architects in the way that is needed out there when it looks so similar as it seemed to do for many years. So I think that, and also concerning ethics and what Kristina talked about, the kind of the need for a more fearless speech, to be more self-confident. I think that in some ways, I think that what the environments here have started to do is to create some kind of base for that at least. But there's quite a lot of more work to do. So.
Comment from Dana?
Is this mic on?
Yeah.
I think taking Joan's conversation and your comment along with Fredrik's, you might ask at this point in the ending of this funding where the money for research is going to come from. Really, like it's the where's the money question. And I think Fredrik's work is an interesting and potentially cautionary tale, right? Because research and practices is often proprietary, meaning when AECOM figures out how to solve the problems of Rwanda, they don't share that with the next big firm because they want the job that's going to take place in Haiti. So, you know, what does that mean for us as scholars and researchers in this new neoliberal world of practice? You've had a kind of luxurious way of cultivating a new generation of researchers, which I really admire, and I think there's a lot of power in the younger, recent doctoral students. But who's funding them now?
Just a brief comment on that, because with the work in the work with our book, there were actually, I will not mention them, but there were offices that we were not allowed to include in the book due to this, while others are very younger officers and so are very happily sharing their knowledge. So I think that it's also part of an old culture of not keeping the knowledge to yourself as a competitive advance. But there are, on the opposite, now young officers seeing it as part of what they need as their own knowledge development, to share and to share in other ways. So.
Anyone else who would like to comment? Well, do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
But is this uncomplicated? I mean, is this really uncomplicated, or is it part of an increasing idea industry, as a recent book? I mean, is it worth being there, acting on the market, so that anybody could be invited? So I would like to reconnect to what Dana was talking about. Who's this for, and where's the ethics?
Brady?
Yeah. One thing that I've brought up and I've tried to also follow myself is also in the academic community, the academic system of increasingly publishing with certain publishers, doing free intellectual work, to peer review, to have your publications published. I would say to, if we collectively publish only in open access, some kind of thoughtful publishing practices, thoughtful something that Ramia, I think, brought up with how do we peer review, how do we give back, rather than buying into the system that is growing. Yeah.
I think it's a pretty radical notion to think of us in academia as being part of an idea industry. I mean, yes, at some level, but I would imagine that all of us would resist that in some fundamental ways. I mean, I'm watching from the University of California the kind of unmaking, as one author put it, of the public university. But I think as a kind of ethics of practice in architectural education, you know, we have special ways through architecture, it seems to me, to resist that, differently than, say, a philosophy department might, or a I don't know, English department. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try to resist that, or to open up other possibilities in the kind of counter-neoliberalist way of what we might be able to contribute that's not part of that market economy of ideas, and, you know, thus serving only the, you know, basically forces of market capitalism.
Thank you, Dana.
How? Yeah.
Okay, the last comment from Joan. Final comment.
Maybe somebody else wants to have the start here. Well, I think this question of how do you monetize research is one that we is unavoidable.
A bit closer.
And you know, it goes back to the period right after the Second World War, when research and development were the name of the game, especially in the social sciences, which were getting all kinds of funding. And of course, I'm talking about the U.S., which I know well. And you know, architects could only sort of look over the big divide to, you know, of their own discipline to say, how can we get a piece of that action? And really were excluded from it up until recently, when I think the digital technology has made it possible, and also the whole discourse of sustainability and new environmental issues that we're facing today have made architects kind of wake up to the fact that, yeah, maybe they too have a product that is commercial. And from that standpoint, especially when you get to research within practices, I mean, you really do have to wonder, who's funding it? Why are they funding it? What's the PR value they get out of it? Then, of course, research in the university, you know, potentially being a utopia, a place where still profit isn't absolutely the name of the game, although more and more the universities are in these partnerships with industry and commercial entities, and so it's the same story. So, you know, we're kind of speaking to the choir here, telling ourselves that we can do something, you know, with our research, but it is a cautionary tale, in other words.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the whole panel, of course, especially Dana and Joan, for joining us today. And I want to thank the audience for staying with us so long. And please stay tuned, because actually we have a program point left. Many thanks to all of you.